April 1945, near Gotha, Germany. German civilians were surprised when American soldiers gave food to their starving children. Anna had hidden her family in the basement. Propaganda posters warned of monsters. She expected the door to splinter. Instead, a sergeant from the 4th Armored Division knocked softly. He wasn't holding a weapon, he held cans of army rations. The official story was that mercy was policy. But the truth felt different in that soldier's eyes, something more than an order. If an enemy saves your child from starvation, is it an act of kindness or an act of war? Let us know your city and local time in the comments. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If memory and mercy matter, subscribe to keep these stories alive. In the final weeks of April 1945, the war in Germany was not ending, it was collapsing. In the small villages surrounding the town of Gotha in Thuringia, the thunder of American artillery had finally gone quiet. For families like the Bauers, the silence that followed was more frightening than the noise. For weeks, the radio had blared warnings. Posters plastered on every wall showed caricatures of monstrous American soldiers, promising cruelty and ruin. A local party official, just before he fled, had gathered the women and children in the square and sworn to them that the enemy's goal was humiliation and starvation. He told them, "They will treat your children like animals." This was the fear that seeped through the cracks of every boarded window and barricaded door. It settled in the damp basements where families huddled, listening to the unfamiliar rumble of American trucks and the crunch of boots on the rubble that had once been their main street. For them, the war was over, but the fight for survival, for dignity, had just begun. The enemy had arrived, and everyone knew what was supposed to happen next. Anna Bauer held her 2 children close in the darkness of their cellar. She was 34, but the last 2 years had carved the lines of a much older woman onto her face. Her husband was a ghost, a name on a letter from the Eastern Front more than a year ago. Now, her entire world was contained in this small, earthen room, with her 10-year-old son Karl and 7-year-old daughter Lena. Karl tried to be brave, clenching his fists, while Lena hid her face in the thin fabric of her mother's dress. They were hungry. Not just the dull, familiar ache of wartime rationing, but a deep, biting hunger that made every sound from the street seem like a threat. The last of their potatoes were gone, the flour scraped from the bottom of the sack. Anna listened to the boots stopping directly outside their home. She braced herself for the splintering wood of the door being kicked in, for the shouts, for the plunder she had been taught to expect. It was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times, the moment she would have to stand between the monsters and her children. But the sound that came was not a crash, it was a knock. 3 soft, deliberate raps on the wood. It was so out of place, so civilized, that for a moment Anna thought she had imagined it. Another knock, just as gentle. Karl looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion. Slowly, trembling, Anna unlatched the cellar door and opened it just a few inches. Standing in the pale afternoon light was an American soldier. He was young, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. He was from the 4th Armored Division, part of General Patton's 3rd Army. But to Anna, he was just the figure from the posters made real. He wasn't snarling or holding a rifle at the ready. He was holding 2 C-ration cans. He saw Anna's fear, then looked past her and saw the small faces of her children in the gloom. The soldier said nothing. He simply held out the cans. He made a gesture, pointing from the cans to Karl and Lena, an unmistakable offering. Karl stared, his mind struggling to connect the image of this quiet man with the stories of beasts he had been told at school. His eyes fixed on one of the cans. It had a brightly colored label showing sliced yellow peaches in syrup. The other item wasn't in a can. It was a thick brown rectangle wrapped in paper, an Army-issue D-ration chocolate bar. To a child who could barely remember the taste of sugar, it looked like a block of gold. What happened next broke through the wall of fear Anna had so carefully built around her heart. The soldier knelt down. He crouched on the dusty ground, deliberately making himself smaller, less intimidating, until his eyes were level with her children's. This single act of humility was more powerful than any weapon. He wasn't a conqueror asserting his dominance. He was a man seeing a hungry child. He held the chocolate bar out toward Karl. Anna's mind flashed with the memory of the party official's sneering voice. They will treat your children like animals. But this man was treating her son with a gentleness she hadn't seen from anyone in uniform in years. Hesitantly, watching his mother's face for permission, Karl reached out a small, grimy hand and took the bar. The soldier gave him a tired smile, then placed the can of peaches in Lena's hands. He stood, gave Anna a short nod, and turned to walk to the next house down the street. Anna closed the door, her back sliding down the rough wood until she was sitting on the floor. She watched her son slowly unwrap the chocolate, his hands shaking slightly. He broke off a piece for his sister before taking a bite himself. He closed his eyes as the sweetness hit his tongue. In that moment, surrounded by the ruin of her country, Anna Bauer whispered to herself, "Everything we were told can't be true. The food was a gift, but the mercy was a weapon, one that had just dismantled her entire understanding of the enemy." The single act of kindness at Anna Bauer's door was not an exception. It was the beginning of a pattern that slowly unraveled years of carefully woven propaganda. In the days that followed, the American presence in their village transformed. The 4th Armored Division, soon joined by elements of the 89th Infantry Division, began a task not of conquest, but of administration. The myth of the monster began to crumble, replaced by the reality of organized, if weary, compassion. In the village schoolyard, where children had once been drilled on the glories of the Reich, American soldiers set up a temporary field kitchen. The smell of cooking food, a scent almost forgotten, drifted through the broken streets, a signal more powerful than any radio broadcast. Soldiers, men who had been fighting their way across Europe for months, now served soup into dented bowls held by the children of their former enemy. They ladled stew from large pots, and quartermaster sergeants, used to calculating supplies for combat troops, now found themselves distributing C rations to German mothers. Some soldiers would split their own personal K rations, sharing the small tins of cheese or meat with wide-eyed toddlers. They joked with the older boys, trying to teach them the English word for hamburger, laughing when the boys repeated it with thick accents. These moments of mercy were small, but concrete. A young GI noticed Anna struggling to keep her children clean with barely a trickle of water and no soap. The next day, he pressed a bar of army-issue soap into her hand without a word. Another soldier, seeing a baby crying from hunger, mixed powdered milk with water in his own helmet and patiently helped the mother feed her infant. For Karl Bauer, the defining moment came with the chocolate. After rationing the first bar for days, making it last as long as possible, he was given another piece. He bit into it with an eagerness that hunger had sharpened to a fine point. The sugar was so rich, so unlike the thin, ersatz sweeteners of the war, that a sharp ache shot through his teeth. It was a good pain, a pain that signaled the end of one world and the beginning of another. These were not the actions of beasts. This was something different, something the posters had never mentioned. This wave of generosity wasn't pure charity. It was rooted in military pragmatism. Official United States Army policy, handed down from General Eisenhower himself, was clear. Civilians in occupied territories must not be allowed to starve. The commanders understood that widespread hunger would lead to epidemics and unrest, creating an unstable environment that would endanger their own troops and complicate the massive task of governing a defeated nation. But resources were severely strained. The first priority for food and medical supplies went to the hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners of war being liberated from German camps, and then to the millions of displaced persons and former slave laborers who were now the responsibility of the Allied armies. German civilians were at the bottom of the list. What Anna and her neighbors were receiving often came from the soldiers' own surplus, or from individual choices to share what little they had. One evening, by the light of a single candle, Anna found a small, clean scrap of a paper flour sack. With a stub of a pencil, she carefully wrote down a few words, not wanting to forget the feeling. "The Americans brought bread," she wrote. It was white, soft. The children smelled it for minutes before eating. This simple observation captured the profound shock of the moment. For years, bread had been dark, coarse, and filled with sawdust to make the flour stretch. This soft, white bread was a symbol of a world of impossible abundance. But trust, once so thoroughly poisoned, was a difficult thing to heal. Not every soldier was like the one who had knocked on her door. Some GIs remained distant, their faces hard and unforgiving. They hoarded their rations, sometimes mocking the hungry families who watched them eat. The propaganda had left its mark on the Germans as well. Elsbeth Kruger, Anna's neighbor, voiced the fears that many others kept silent. She watched the Americans serving soup and muttered that it was surely poisoned, a trick to finish what the bombs had started. Her own son refused to eat, turning his head away in terror until he saw his little sister take a spoonful from her mother, swallow, and then break into a wide, milky smile. Only then did the boy relent, his fear finally overpowered by his hunger. For Anna and the other mothers, each day brought a new contradiction, a new reason to question everything they had been taught. The fear was fading, but in its place grew a profound and unsettling confusion. The weeks after the surrender bled into the early summer of 1945, and a fragile new routine settled over the village. The American field kitchen in the schoolyard became the center of daily life. For Anna and her children, the day was now measured by the promise of that one warm meal. The initial fear of the American soldiers had been replaced by a quiet, watchful dependence. The children learned to say hello and thank you, and the GIs learned their names. The white bread and canned peaches were no longer a shocking miracle, but a lifeline. This period of stability, however, was built on the temporary presence of combat troops. As May turned to June, the familiar faces of the 4th Armored Division disappeared. The trucks that had brought them were now taking them away, and new trucks arrived carrying different men. These soldiers were part of the formal U.S. military government, tasked with the long, grueling work of occupation. They carried clipboards and lists, and their faces were set with the grim focus of administrators, not the weary compassion of frontline soldiers. The responsibility for feeding civilians was shifting to larger, more organized bodies, including the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, known as UNRRA. With this change came a different set of rules. The logic of post-war Europe was brutal and unsentimental. Across the continent, millions were starving. The Allied command had to make impossible choices. The absolute first priority for food, medicine, and shelter went to the Allied prisoners of war emerging like skeletons from German camps. The next priority was for the millions of displaced persons, the slave laborers, political prisoners, and refugees who had been torn from their homes and were now wandering a shattered landscape. German civilians were designated as enemy population, and they were last in line. The generous, informal sharing from soldiers' personal rations was replaced by a rigid system of distribution. By the summer of 1945, the official ration for many German civilians was limited to just 1,200 calories a day, far below the amount needed for a healthy adult, let alone a growing child. The children who had begun to get a little color back in their cheeks started to look thin again. The energy they had found to play in the streets began to fade. Anna felt a familiar dread creeping back into her heart. The lifeline was fraying. One afternoon, holding Lena's hand, and with Carl trailing behind, Anna walked to the schoolyard. The queue was longer, the atmosphere more tense. At the front of the line stood a new officer, a lieutenant whose uniform was cleaner and crisper than any she had seen before. He was overseeing the distribution, ensuring every ladle of soup was measured precisely. When Anna reached the front, she received their family's allotted share. It was noticeably less than before. Looking at her children's hungry faces, she did something she had never done before. She swallowed her pride and asked the officer for a little more. She pointed to her children, her voice barely a whisper. The officer, Lieutenant McKay, did not look angry. He simply looked tired. He glanced at her, then at his list. "Regulations," he said, his voice polite but firm. "Civilians last. I cannot make exceptions." Lena began to cry, a thin, hungry whimper. Anna felt a hot flush of shame and a cold wave of betrayal. She pulled her children away, the meager rations feeling heavier than ever. The mercy she had begun to trust had been temporary, conditional. It could be given, and it could be taken away by a man with a list. The story of the refusal spread through the village like a sickness. Frau Kruger, her earlier suspicions now seemingly confirmed, found a grim satisfaction in the new hardship. "You see," she said to anyone who would listen, "they fed us only to break our pride. It was a game to make us weak, to make us dependent on them." The doubt that had been sleeping was now wide awake, and it began to corrode the memory of the kindness they had been shown. The soldiers' smiles were reinterpreted as strategic deceptions. The chocolate and peaches were no longer gifts, but bait in a trap. As the summer waned, the fear of the coming winter grew. It would be known as the hunger winter, a time when daily rations in some zones would fall to less than 1,000 calories. That evening, back in her small, dim room, Anna Bauer took out the scrap of paper from the flour sack. She read the words she had written just weeks before. The Americans brought bread. Beneath them, her hand shaking slightly, she added a new, agonizing thought. Perhaps mercy is just another tactic of war. Can kindness ever be trusted? The years that followed the hunger winter were a slow, arduous crawl back toward normalcy. Germany was a nation grappling with its own shadow, a landscape of both physical and moral ruin. For the children like Carl and Lena Bauer who grew up in the rubble, memory became a fractured thing. They lived with a double inheritance. In one hand, they held the ghost stories of the war, the dark warnings from their teachers and the propaganda posters about the monstrous Amis. In the other, they held a far more powerful and confusing memory. The taste of their first piece of real chocolate, the softness of white bread, the bright, syrupy sweetness of canned peaches given to them by the very monsters they were told to fear. This contradiction became the quiet, unspoken truth of their generation. It was a truth rarely discussed in public. The national shame was too great, the guilt too heavy. To speak of an American soldier's kindness felt, in some circles, like a betrayal of their own fathers and brothers who had died fighting those same soldiers. And so, the stories were kept private, whispered between mothers over mended clothes, or shared in hushed tones between neighbors. Anna and Elsbeth Kruger, once on opposite sides of trust and suspicion, now found common ground in this shared, complex memory. They agreed that the hardship that came later was real, the bureaucratic coldness undeniable, but the memory of that first arrival, that first act of mercy, refused to be erased. It stubbornly remained, a small, bright light in a vast darkness. Anna never threw away the scrap of paper from the flour sack. She kept it folded neatly in a small wooden box with her husband's last letter. She would sometimes take it out and read the two conflicting sentences she had written. The Americans brought bread, and can kindness ever be trusted? Over time, she came to understand that both statements could be true at once. Mercy was not a simple, clean thing. It could be both a genuine human impulse and a temporary tool of occupation. It could be given by one man and withheld by another. She taught her children this difficult lesson, that the world was not divided into monsters and saints, but was filled with complicated people making choices, sometimes kind and sometimes cruel. The story of the soldier who knelt became a piece of their family history. It was their own private testament, a reminder that even in the midst of a terrible war, a moment of dignity was possible. The memory was not about the food itself, but about the way it was given. It was about a victor choosing to see the humanity in a defeated child. This became the anchor of their post-war world, a truth more resilient than any government policy or official narrative. While the nation struggled with its grand, historical guilt, families like the Bauers held on to these small, personal moments of grace. Decades later, long after the village had been rebuilt and the scars on the landscape had faded, Carl Bauer was an old man. His hair was white, his hands were spotted with age, but his eyes were still clear. He sat in a comfortable chair, in a warm, well-lit room, a life of peace and hard work behind him. When asked about the war, he rarely spoke of the battles or the bombings. He did not speak of the propaganda or the hunger. Instead, his memory always returned to that single afternoon in April of 1945. He could still feel the damp chill of the cellar air and the rough texture of his mother's dress. He could still see the American sergeant, his face young and tired, his uniform covered in dust. He remembered the soldier's eyes, the way they looked right at him, not through him. And he remembered the can of peaches. The label was impossibly bright, a splash of color in a gray world. He recalled the unexpected weight of it in his small hands, a solid promise of sweetness. Many people will tell you the war ended when the surrender was signed, Carl would say, his voice soft with the quiet authority of a lifelong witness. For me, that is not the moment. The papers and the radios, that was for the generals and the politicians. He would lean forward slightly, as if sharing a secret of immense importance. The war ended for me when that soldier crouched down in the dirt. He was the enemy, the man we were supposed to fear more than anything, but he knelt to look me in the eye, and he handed me food when he could have taken everything. He saw a hungry boy, not a little enemy. That was the first time I believed the war was truly over. In his memory, the end of the greatest conflict in human history was not a trumpet blast or a grand declaration. It was a quiet, human gesture, a knock instead of a kick, an offering instead of a demand. In war, mercy is never expected. That is why it is never forgotten.